Have you ever been labeled something so cruel that it made you question your own worth? Have you ever had people assume the worst about your character based on nothing but appearances and gossip? Today's story will show you why assumptions can be dangerous and why the truth always has a way of surfacing when you least expect it. Sometimes the person everyone thinks they know turns out to be someone completely different. Sarah Chen had always been the kind of woman who turned heads without trying. At 28, she possessed a natural elegance that couldn't be bought or taught. Her long black hair cascaded down her shoulders like silk, and her warm brown eyes held a depth that spoke of someone who had seen both joy and hardship. She moved through the world with quiet confidence, never demanding attention, but somehow always commanding it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Working as a pediatric nurse at Children's Memorial Hospital had shaped Sarah into someone who understood suffering and healing in equal measure. She had chosen nursing not because it was easy or well-paying, but because she genuinely believed in helping others. Every morning at 7, she would arrive at the hospital wearing simple scrubs and comfortable shoes, ready to spend 12 hours caring for sick children and supporting worried families. Her colleagues respected her dedication and skill. Parents trusted her with their most precious possessions. Children smiled when they saw her coming down the hallway. Sarah had built a reputation over 6 years of service that was based entirely on her character and competence. She lived modestly in a small apartment downtown, drove a 10-year-old Honda Civic, and spent her free time reading medical journals or volunteering at the local animal shelter. Life changed completely the night she met David Hamilton at a charity fundraiser for the hospital. Sarah had been reluctant to attend, preferring quiet evenings at home to social events. But her supervisor had insisted that the nursing staff needed representation at the gala. She had borrowed a simple black dress from her roommate and taken the bus to the downtown hotel where the event was being held. David was standing near the auction tables when she first noticed him. He was tall and distinguished, probably in his mid-30s, with sandy brown hair and kind blue eyes. Unlike many of the other attendees, who seemed more interested in being seen than supporting the cause, David appeared genuinely engaged with the auction items, particularly those benefiting the children's ward where Sarah worked. Their conversation began naturally when David asked her opinion about which auction items would have the most impact on patient care. Sarah found herself talking passionately about the needs of the hospital, describing how new equipment could transform treatment outcomes and how small comforts could mean everything to frightened children and their families. David listened intently, asking thoughtful questions that showed he truly understood the importance of what she was saying. As the evening progressed, Sarah discovered that David possessed an unexpected combination of intelligence, humor, and genuine compassion. He seemed fascinated by her work, asking detailed questions about her experiences as a pediatric nurse. When she mentioned her volunteer work at the animal shelter, his face lit up with interest. He told her about his own rescue dog, a golden retriever named Max, who had been abandoned as a puppy. David was remarkably down-to-earth for someone attending such an upscale event. He wore a well-tailored suit, but seemed more comfortable discussing hospital policies than stock portfolios. When Sarah mentioned that she had taken the bus to the gala, David offered to drive her home without any hint of judgment about her transportation situation. During the drive, their conversation flowed effortlessly from serious topics to shared laughter. He told her he worked in business, but remained vague about the specifics when she asked. Sarah assumed he was probably a middle manager or consultant who preferred to keep work and personal life separate. She appreciated that he seemed more interested in talking about her career than promoting his own accomplishments. Most of the men she had dated seemed eager to impress her with their job titles or financial success, but David appeared content to let the conversation focus on subjects that mattered to both of them. Their first official date was coffee at a small cafe near the hospital. David arrived early, already seated at a quiet corner table with 2 steaming cups and a selection of pastries.
He had remembered that she mentioned preferring lattes with an extra shot of espresso during their previous conversation. This attention to detail touched Sarah more than any expensive gesture could have. Over the following months, their relationship developed with surprising ease. David would often meet Sarah after her shifts, appearing in the hospital lobby with takeout from her favorite restaurants or homemade sandwiches for the drive to wherever they were spending the evening. He never complained about her irregular schedule or the emotional demands of her job. Instead, he seemed to understand instinctively when she needed to talk about a difficult day or when she simply needed quiet companionship. David integrated seamlessly into her modest lifestyle. He seemed genuinely content spending evenings in her small apartment, watching movies or cooking simple meals together. When they went out, he chose restaurants and activities that matched her budget, never making her feel inadequate about her financial limitations. He drove a practical sedan rather than a flashy sports car, wore casual clothes that looked expensive but weren't ostentatious, and talked about everyday concerns rather than luxury purchases or exotic vacations. Sarah introduced David to her friends and colleagues gradually, and everyone who met him liked him immediately. He had a gift for making people feel comfortable and valued.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. When Sarah's roommate was going through a difficult breakup, David spent an entire evening listening to her problems and offering thoughtful advice. When one of Sarah's coworkers mentioned struggling with car repairs, David recommended a trustworthy mechanic and even offered to accompany her to ensure she wasn't overcharged. The proposal came 8 months after they met, during a quiet evening walk through the park near Sarah's apartment. David had seemed nervous all day, fumbling with his phone and checking his watch repeatedly. As they sat on their favorite bench overlooking the pond, he suddenly dropped to one knee and produced a beautiful but understated engagement ring. His voice shook slightly as he told Sarah that she had changed his life completely and that he couldn't imagine facing the future without her. Sarah said yes without hesitation. The ring was perfect, elegant but not ostentatious, exactly what she would have chosen for herself. David explained that he had consulted with her roommate to determine her preferences, another example of his thoughtful nature. They decided on a small wedding ceremony, agreeing that they would rather spend money on their future together than on one elaborate day. The engagement period was blissful. Sarah threw herself into planning a modest wedding while continuing her demanding work schedule. David supported every decision she made, from the choice of venue to the selection of flowers. He seemed genuinely excited about their simple ceremony and showed no interest in expanding the guest list or upgrading the arrangements. When Sarah worried about the cost of even their modest celebration, David assured her that they could afford everything she wanted without going into debt. Sarah's happiness was evident to everyone who knew her. She glowed with the contentment of someone who had found her perfect match. Her colleagues teased her good-naturedly about her obvious joy, and her patients' families commented on her radiant smile. Even the most difficult days at the hospital seemed manageable when she knew David would be waiting for her at the end of her shift. However, not everyone in Sarah's circle was celebrating her engagement. Her friend Lisa, who worked as a paralegal at a prestigious law firm downtown, had begun making subtle comments about David's background. Lisa claimed to recognize him from somewhere, but couldn't quite place where. She suggested that David might not be as straightforward as he seemed, pointing out that he had never clearly explained what kind of business work he did. These concerns initially seemed like jealousy to Sarah. Lisa had been unlucky in love, enduring a series of disappointing relationships with men who had ultimately proven untrustworthy. Sarah assumed that Lisa's warnings stemmed from her own romantic disappointments, rather than any genuine insight about David's character. Sarah had spent months getting to know David intimately, and everything she had observed convinced her that he was exactly who he claimed to be. The most hurtful accusation was that Sarah was a gold digger who had somehow manipulated David into proposing. This rumor was particularly painful because it was so completely contrary to reality. Sarah had never shown any interest in David's financial situation, had never asked him to spend money on her, and had consistently insisted on paying her own way whenever possible. She had fallen in love with David's character, not his wallet. The rumors reached Sarah through well-meaning friends who thought she should know what people were saying. Each report felt like a physical blow, undermining her confidence and casting doubt on her previously unshakable happiness. Sarah began to notice subtle changes in how some people treated her, from the hospital staff who had always been supportive to casual acquaintances who now seemed to view her with suspicion. These whispers created an undercurrent of tension during what should have been the most joyful period of Sarah's life. She found herself second-guessing decisions and analyzing David's behavior for signs that might support the rumors. When David paid for dinner, she wondered if people would see it as evidence of her supposed gold-digging tendencies. When he surprised her with small gifts, she worried that others would interpret his generosity as proof of their accusations. The stress began affecting Sarah's work performance and emotional well-being. She had always prided herself on maintaining professional composure regardless of personal circumstances, but the constant speculation about her motives was wearing her down. She started declining social invitations to avoid confronting the rumors directly, which only seemed to fuel more speculation about her behavior. David noticed Sarah's growing distress but misunderstood its source. He assumed she was simply experiencing normal pre-wedding anxiety and tried to reassure her with increased attention and affection. His kindness only made Sarah feel worse about doubting him, creating a cycle of guilt and confusion that intensified as their wedding date approached. The situation reached a breaking point the day before Sarah's appointment with the lawyer. Lisa confronted Sarah directly, claiming that she had finally remembered where she had seen David before. According to Lisa, David Hamilton was actually David Hamilton Westbrook, heir to one of the largest private equity firms in the country. Lisa insisted that she had seen his photograph in business magazines and that he was worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Sarah initially dismissed Lisa's claims as fantasy, pointing out that David lived modestly and showed no signs of extraordinary wealth. Lisa argued that wealthy people often lived below their means for privacy reasons and that David's behavior was consistent with someone trying to hide his true identity. She urged Sarah to investigate David's background before signing any legal documents or proceeding with the wedding. That night, Sarah lay awake beside David, studying his sleeping face and trying to reconcile Lisa's accusations with everything she knew about the man she loved. David looked peaceful and ordinary, nothing like her mental image of a billionaire heir. His apartment was comfortable but not luxurious, his car was practical rather than impressive, and his lifestyle seemed entirely consistent with someone earning a middle-class income. Yet doubt had been planted, and Sarah found herself remembering small details that might support Lisa's theory. David never seemed concerned about money, even when making generous gestures. He had offered to pay for her legal consultation without checking his bank balance. He had assured her that they could afford their honeymoon without explaining how he knew their finances were adequate. The morning of her lawyer appointment arrived with Sarah still torn between trust and suspicion. She dressed carefully in her best professional outfit, gathered the prenuptial agreement and supporting documents, and took the bus downtown to the law office David had recommended. She had decided that whatever the lawyer told her about the document would determine her next course of action. The law office was located in one of the city's most prestigious buildings, occupying an entire floor with panoramic views of the downtown area. Sarah felt intimidated by the elegant reception area and impeccably dressed staff, wondering if she was dressed appropriately for such an upscale environment. The receptionist greeted her warmly and escorted her to a conference room where attorney Margaret Chen was waiting. Margaret Chen was a woman in her 50s with silver hair and intelligent eyes, who immediately put Sarah at ease with her professional but approachable manner. She explained that she specialized in family law and prenuptial agreements, and that she would review every aspect of Sarah's document to ensure she understood its implications completely. Margaret emphasized that Sarah should ask questions about anything that seemed unclear or concerning. As Margaret began reading through the prenuptial agreement,
Her expression gradually changed from routine professionalism to surprise, then to something that looked almost like shock. She read certain sections multiple times, referring to supporting documents and making notes in the margins. After nearly an hour of careful review, Margaret looked up at Sarah with an expression of professional amazement. "Miss Chen, I need to ask you something very important before we proceed. Do you have any idea who your fiancé really is?" Sarah felt her stomach drop. "What do you mean? He's David Hamilton."
He works in business. Margaret opened her laptop and turned the screen towards Sarah. Your fiancé is David Hamilton Westbrook III, the sole heir to Westbrook Industries. According to Forbes, his personal net worth exceeds $2 billion. The words hit Sarah like ice water. She stared at the business article on Margaret's screen, featuring a professional photograph of David at some corporate event. He looked different in the expensive suit and polished setting, but it was unmistakably him. "That's impossible," Sarah whispered. "David drives a Honda. He lives in a modest apartment. We eat at casual restaurants." Margaret nodded sympathetically. Wealthy individuals often maintain modest public personas for privacy and security reasons. But Sarah, this prenuptial agreement isn't what you think it is. Sarah's hands trembled as Margaret began explaining the document's contents. Instead of protecting David's assets from Sarah, the prenup was designed to transfer enormous wealth to her. Upon marriage, Sarah would become the beneficiary of a $50 million trust fund. If the marriage lasted 5 years, she would inherit David's entire estate regardless of circumstances. If David died before her, she would become one of the wealthiest women in the country. "This isn't a standard prenup," Margaret continued. "This is essentially David signing over his fortune to you. The language is ironclad. Once you marry him, these assets become legally yours." Sarah felt dizzy. But why would he do this? Why wouldn't he just tell me the truth about who he is? Margaret gathered the documents carefully. "I can't speak to his motivations, but I can tell you this is the most generous prenuptial agreement I've ever reviewed. Your fiancé clearly trusts you completely." The bus ride home felt surreal. Sarah clutched the manila folder containing copies of the legal documents, her mind racing through months of memories that now made perfect sense. David's mysterious work schedule, his unconcern about money, his ability to recommend expensive lawyers, even his choice of restaurants suddenly seemed calculated to match her lifestyle rather than his. When Sarah arrived at her apartment, David was waiting in the kitchen with Chinese takeout from their favorite restaurant. He looked up with his usual warm smile, but Sarah saw something different now. The casual clothes couldn't hide his innate confidence, and his relaxed demeanor seemed more like someone comfortable with power than someone without it. "How did the lawyer meeting go?" David asked, but his voice carried a tension that hadn't been there before. Sarah set the folder on the counter between them. David Hamilton Westbrook III? The color drained from David's face. He sat down heavily at the small dining table and buried his head in his hands. "I can explain." $2 billion, David? You're worth $2 billion, and you let me worry about paying for our honeymoon? David looked up with tears in his eyes. "Sarah, I've been trying to figure out how to tell you for months. Every time I started, I got scared that you'd think I was lying or that everything would change between us." Sarah felt anger rising alongside her shock. "So instead, you let people call me a gold digger. You let them say I was using you for money while you're secretly a billionaire?" "I never wanted anyone to say those things about you," David said desperately. "I thought if people didn't know who I really was, they'd see our relationship for what it actually is."
"Which is what, exactly?" Sarah's voice was getting louder. "Because I'm not sure I know anymore." David stood up and moved toward her, but Sarah stepped back. "It's real, Sarah. Everything between us is real. I fell in love with you that first night at the hospital fundraiser. Not because you were impressed by my money, because you didn't even know about it. You loved me for who I am, not what I have." "But you lied to me for months," Sarah said. About everything. Your job, your life, your family. I didn't lie, David protested. I just didn't tell you the whole truth. I do work in business. I do care about the things we've talked about. The only difference is the scale. Sarah opened the folder and pulled out the prenup. And this? You were going to sign over $50 million to me without even mentioning it? David's shoulders sagged. I wanted you to be secure. I wanted to know that no matter what happened, you'd never have to worry about money again. You work so hard at the hospital, Sarah. You give everything to those kids and their families. I wanted to give something back to you. By lying to me? By protecting you, David said quietly. Do you know what happens when people find out who I really am? They change. They start seeing dollar signs instead of a person. They want things from me. They pretend to care about me when they really care about my bank account. Sarah sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the enormity of what she was learning. So you tested me? You pretended to be someone else to see if I'd love you without money? No, David said firmly. I never tested you. I just wanted to be loved for who I am, not what I inherited. Sarah, you're the first person in my adult life who's never asked me for anything. You've never even let me pay for dinner without insisting on splitting the check. The truth of that statement hit Sarah hard. She thought about all the times she'd insisted on paying her own way, all the modest dates she'd suggested, all the times she'd worried about being a financial burden on him. Meanwhile, David could have bought the restaurant where they ate their first meal together. The night we met, Sarah said slowly, you weren't just attending that fundraiser, were you? David shook his head. Westbrook Industries was the primary sponsor. I donated the money for the new pediatric wing. You donated? Sarah felt dizzy again.
David, that was $5 million. It was the right thing to do, he said simply, and meeting you there felt like fate. Sarah stared at the man she thought she knew completely. Who are you really? David sat down across from her at the small table where they'd shared hundreds of casual meals. I'm the same person who brings you coffee after your difficult shifts. I'm the same person who listens to you talk about your patients and your dreams. I'm the same person who loves watching old movies with you on Sunday afternoons. The money doesn't change any of that. But it changes everything else, Sarah said. David, people think I'm marrying you for money I didn't even know you had. And now that I do know, how can I marry you without everyone assuming that's exactly what I'm doing? Because you know the truth, David said. We know the truth. Sarah, I've spent my entire adult life wondering if people cared about me or my inheritance. With you, I never had to wonder. You fell in love with me when you thought I was just some middle management guy who drove a Honda. Sarah looked down at the engagement ring on her finger. It was beautiful and clearly expensive, but now she realized it was probably worth more than she made in several years. This ring belonged to my grandmother, David said. It's not about the value, Sarah. It's about what it represents. She told me to give it to someone who loved me for who I am, not what I have. Tears started flowing down Sarah's cheeks. I don't know how to process this, David. Yesterday, I was worried about affording flowers for our wedding. Today, I find out I'm marrying one of the richest men in the country. You're marrying me, David said gently. The money is just details. Details? Sarah laughed through her tears. David, this prenup makes me incredibly wealthy just for saying I do. How is that details? Because I want to share my life with you, he said. All of it, including the responsibility that comes with having resources like these. Sarah, you could fund a dozen new pediatric wings. You could start your own children's hospital. You could change thousands of lives. The magnitude of possibility began sinking in. Sarah thought about all the times she'd watched families struggle with medical bills, all the equipment the hospital needed but couldn't afford, all the research projects that went unfunded while children suffered. Why didn't you just tell me?
she asked finally. David reached across the table and took her hands. Because I was scared. I've had people pretend to love me for my money before. I've had relationships that seemed real until I realized they were just elaborate performances. With you, I knew it was different, but I was terrified of taking the chance.
So you were going to wait until after we were married to tell me I was rich? I was going to tell you on our honeymoon, David admitted. I thought if we were already married, you'd know for certain that I trusted you completely. Sarah pulled her hands away and stood up, pacing around the small kitchen. David, do you realize what you've put me through? The rumors, the accusations, the way people have been looking at me. I know, and I'm sorry. I never wanted you to be hurt by any of this. But I was hurt, Sarah said. I've been questioning everything about our relationship because people kept telling me you couldn't possibly love someone like me unless I was using you somehow. David's face crumpled. Sarah, you're the best person I've ever known. You're kind, brilliant, compassionate, and beautiful. Anyone would be lucky to have you love them. Then why hide who you are? Because I wanted you to know that first, he said. I wanted you to see me as David, not as David Westbrook, heir to a fortune. I wanted our love to be pure. Sarah stopped pacing and looked at him. Our love was pure, David, but our relationship was built on a lie. Not a lie, he protested, an omission. A $2 billion omission. They sat in silence for several minutes, both processing the weight of the revelation. Finally, Sarah spoke again. What happens now? That's up to you, David said quietly. I understand if you need time to think about this. I understand if you're angry with me. I understand if you can't trust me anymore. Sarah looked at the prenuptial agreement again, then at David. You really were going to give me $50 million without telling me? I was going to give you everything, he said, because that's what you do when you love someone. You share your life with them. Even if it means they might leave you once they know the truth? David nodded. Even then. Sarah, I'd rather lose you because of who I really am than keep you because of who I pretended to be. The honesty in his voice broke through Sarah's anger. She realized that while David had hidden his wealth, he had never hidden his character. The man who had spent hours listening to her talk about difficult patients was the same man sitting across from her now. The man who had volunteered to help her coworkers with their problems was the same man who had secretly donated millions to help sick children. I need some time, Sarah said finally. I need to think about all of this. David nodded, tears streaming down his face. I understand. I'll give you all the time you need. As David gathered his things to leave, Sarah called out to him, David, the prenup?
If I sign it, if we get married, what happens to us? He turned back with hope in his eyes. We build a life together. We use the resources we have to help people. We stay exactly who we are, just with more opportunities to make a difference. After David left, Sarah sat alone in her apartment, surrounded by the evidence of their modest life together. The takeout containers from casual restaurants, photos from simple dates, the engagement ring that represented a love she had thought was based on equality and mutual respect. Now she knew the truth. David Hamilton was David Westbrook, heir to billions, and he had fallen in love with a pediatric nurse who drove a 10-year-old Honda and worried about splitting dinner checks. He had been willing to give her everything he had, including his fortune, without her even knowing what she was receiving. The next morning, Sarah made her decision. She called David and asked him to meet her at the park where he had proposed. When he arrived, looking nervous and exhausted, Sarah was sitting on their favorite bench with the prenuptial agreement in her lap. I've made my decision, she said as he sat down beside her. David waited, his entire future hanging in the balance. I'm going to sign it, Sarah said, but I have conditions. Relief flooded David's face. Anything. No more secrets, Sarah said firmly. No more omissions. If we're going to build a life together, it has to be based on complete honesty. Agreed, David said immediately. And I want to keep working, Sarah continued. I want to keep being a nurse. The money doesn't change who I am or what I care about. Of course, David said. I fell in love with a nurse. I want to stay married to one. Sarah smiled for the first time since learning the truth. And I want to use some of that money to help people. Real help. The kind that makes a difference. That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say, David said, taking her hand. As they sat together in the park where their engagement had begun, Sarah realized that while everything had changed, nothing had changed. David was still the man who brought her coffee after difficult shifts. She was still the woman who had fallen in love with his kindness and character. The money would allow them to help more people, but it wouldn't change who they were to each other. The rumors about Sarah being a gold digger would probably never completely disappear, but now she knew the truth. She had fallen in love with a man she thought was ordinary, and he had fallen in love with her without her knowing he was extraordinary. Their love story wasn't about money at all. It was about two people who had found something real in a world full of pretense. 3 weeks later, Sarah Chen married David Hamilton Westbrook III in the small ceremony they had originally planned. The only difference was that now Sarah knew she was signing the prenup that would make her one of the wealthiest women in the country. But as she walked down the aisle toward the man she loved, all she could think about was the life they would build together and the good they could do with the resources they had been given. The people who had called her a gold digger never learned about the prenup that proved them completely wrong. But Sarah didn't need their validation anymore. She knew who she was, she knew who David was, and she knew their love was real. Everything else was just details. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.